For almost 2 years after Auschwitz was liberated, nobody died there. Then, one man walked through its gates one last time. He wasn't a prisoner. He wasn't dragged there in chains. He was the man who built the camp. And technically, he wasn't even the last prisoner executed at Auschwitz. He was the last person ever executed there, in any capacity. That distinction matters, and by the end of this video, it will make sense why. His name was Rudolf Höss. Former SS officers who knew him described him as quiet, reserved, almost boring. He didn't scream speeches. He didn't stand at the front giving dramatic orders. He sat behind a desk. He filled out reports. He solved logistical problems the way any manager might. And from behind that desk, over 1 million people died. That contradiction is what makes his story worth telling. Not because he was uniquely evil in some cartoonish way, but because he wasn't. He was disturbingly normal, and normal men, given the right system and the right orders, turned out to be capable of something almost incomprehensible. To understand how a quiet bureaucrat became one of history's most efficient killers, it helps to understand what Auschwitz actually was. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within months, the occupying regime began building a network of camps across the country. Auschwitz was one of them, established in 1940 near the town of Auschwitz, a location chosen partly because of its rail connections. At the time, almost no one could have guessed why that detail would matter so much later. The camp was originally meant to hold Polish political prisoners, intellectuals, resistance members, priests, anyone the occupying government considered a threat. In its earliest form, Auschwitz looked more like a brutal labor prison than the site it would eventually become. But Höss wasn't even supposed to end up there for long. He was an ambitious officer looking to prove himself within the SS, and Auschwitz at first was just another assignment, a stepping stone. Nobody, including Höss himself, seemed to fully grasp what it would turn into. Then everything changed. The camp expanded. A second, much larger site was built nearby, called Birkenau. This is the image most people picture today when they hear the name Auschwitz, the long rail line running straight through the main gate, rows of wooden barracks stretching toward the horizon. Gas chambers were constructed, crematoria were added. Rail lines were extended directly into the camp so that trains could unload their passengers as close as possible to where they would be killed. What had started as a prison became something else entirely, a facility engineered specifically for mass killing. By the time Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, roughly 1.1 million people had been murdered there, most of them Jewish men, women, and children deported from across occupied Europe. Others included Roma families, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents from a dozen countries. Rudolf Höss ran it. To understand why a man like him ended up in that position, it helps to go back further, to a much younger version of him. Höss was born in 1900 in Baden-Baden, Germany. His father wanted him to become a priest and raised him in a strict, disciplined Catholic household. Instead, as a teenager, Höss lied about his age and enlisted to fight in the First World War. He saw combat before he was even old enough to legally drink. By the time the war ended, something in him had hardened. Germany's defeat left him angry and directionless, and like a lot of young ex-soldiers with nowhere to put that anger, he found his way into the Free Corps, violent paramilitary groups fighting communist uprisings in the chaos of post-war Germany. It was unofficial, lawless work, and it suited him. During this period, Höss was convicted of taking part in a brutal murder and spent years in prison for it. He made one decision after his release that would define the rest of his life. He joined the growing Nazi movement, and in 1934, the SS. Heinrich Himmler noticed him almost immediately, not because Höss was charismatic or ideologically brilliant. By most accounts, he was neither. Himmler noticed him because he was obedient, disciplined, and willing to do exactly what he was told without asking questions. That was rarer and more valuable to the SS than charisma. Himmler sent him to train at Dachau, one of the earliest concentration camps, where Höss learned the administrative machinery of imprisonment, how to organize, transport, and control large numbers of people with minimal resistance. In 1940, he was appointed commandant of a new camp being built in occupied Poland, Auschwitz. He did not invent Nazi ideology. He wasn't the architect behind the Holocaust's political framework, and he never claimed to be. He was something else, an administrator who took an abstract, monstrous idea handed down from above and turned it into a functioning, efficient system. That was his specific, singular contribution to history's darkest chapter. This is where the story gets darker, not through graphic detail, but through scale. Under Host, Auschwitz-Birkenau expanded rapidly. In 1941, testing began using a pesticide called Zyklon B as a mass killing method. Host later described it, in chillingly plain administrative language, as faster and requiring less manpower than anything used before. He wrote about it the way an engineer might write about upgrading a piece of machinery. Trains arrived constantly. Families stepped off cattle cars after days of travel without food or water, disoriented and exhausted, straight into what became known as selections, a brief glance from an SS officer deciding who lived a little longer and who didn't. Most never learned what was happening until it was already too late to matter. The chimneys never stopped smoking. Every train that arrived meant another line of people disappearing behind brick walls within hours. Death under Host became a timetable. Arrivals, selections, and killings were coordinated with the same bureaucratic precision as any industrial operation, scheduled and logged like shipments. And here's the detail that stops most people cold. Host didn't run this operation from a distance. He lived right next to it. He and his wife raised their children in a comfortable villa just outside the camp walls, close enough that the smell from the crematoria reached their garden. His kids played outside, rode bicycles, and swam in a small pool while meters away, the machinery of mass murder ran around the clock. His wife later described their years there as some of the happiest of her life. In 1943, Host was removed as commandant following an internal investigation into corruption among camp staff, not because of the killing, but because of stolen valuables taken from murdered prisoners. Even within a system built on mass murder, it was theft that got him reassigned. But he wasn't finished. In 1944, he was sent back to Auschwitz temporarily to oversee the mass deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews, an operation so large and so fast that it would later be referred to by his own name. In a matter of months, several 100,000 more people were killed under his direct planning. Then, in 1945, it all came apart. Soviet forces pushed westward. The SS began evacuating Auschwitz and destroying evidence as fast as they could. Prisoners who could still walk were forced onto brutal winter death marches away from the advancing Red Army. Camp records were burned in the days before liberation, and Rudolf Host disappeared. When Germany collapsed a few months later, everyone assumed he was gone for good. Some believed he'd escaped to South America, the way other high-ranking Nazi officials would later attempt. Others thought he was already dead, one more architect of the Holocaust who'd quietly ended his own life rather than face judgment, the way Himmler himself had. Neither was true. He hadn't run far, and he hadn't run loudly. Using a false name, Franz Lang, Host became a farmer in northern Germany, working under a British occupation zone that had no idea who he was. He worked with his hands, kept a low profile, and blended into rural post-war life. For nearly a year, the man responsible for over 1 million deaths lived quietly among ordinary people who had no idea who he really was. But the Allies were already looking. British military investigators, working alongside witnesses and former prisoners, worked methodically to track down high-ranking SS officials before they could vanish for good. Survivors provided crucial testimony and descriptions that helped narrow the search, piecing together names, ranks, and last known locations. Eventually, they found his wife. At first, she said nothing. She held her ground under repeated questioning, refusing to give up her husband's location even as investigators pressed her. But British officers applied pressure, reportedly threatening to hand over her son to Soviet authorities if she kept lying, knowing what that would likely mean for him. Then his wife made a decision. She broke and told them exactly where to find him. On the night of March 11, 1946, British soldiers raided the farm where Rudolf Host was living under his false identity. He tried to maintain the disguise for a moment, giving a false name, acting confused by the intrusion. It didn't hold. Faced with the evidence investigators had already gathered, he admitted who he was. The man who once decided the fate of over 1 million people now had none of his own. He was brought first to testify at the Nuremberg trials, where he gave calm, detailed testimony about the operations at Auschwitz, describing the killing process in the same flat procedural tone he'd used while running it. It wasn't a dramatic confession full of remorse or breakdown, it was almost administrative in tone. And that, more than anything else, is what disturbed the people sitting in that courtroom. He talked about murdering 1 million people the way someone might describe managing a warehouse. His defense, when he offered one at all, was the same one so many others gave in that courtroom. He claimed he was simply following orders, that the decisions had come from above him, and that his job had been execution of policy, not creation of it. Afterward, he was extradited to Poland to face trial specifically for what he had done at Auschwitz. The Polish court gathered overwhelming evidence, camp records that had survived destruction, testimony from survivors who had lived through what he built, and his own detailed admissions. There was no meaningful argument left for his lawyers to make. The scale of what had happened and his direct role in engineering it was undeniable. While awaiting execution in a Polish prison cell, Host did something almost nobody expected. He wrote page after page of memoirs, later published as Commandant of Auschwitz, describing his life, his career, and his role in the camp with the same unsettling calm he had shown at Nuremberg. He wasn't writing to plead for his life. By that point, he seemed to know that possibility was gone. He was writing, it seems, simply to explain himself in exhaustive and chilling detail. Decades later, his own daughter would describe him not as a monster, but as a loving, gentle father, a man who read to his children and cared for their pets. That detail still unsettles historians trying to make sense of how the same man could be both. The Polish court sentenced Rudolf Host to death by hanging. 2 years after Auschwitz had been liberated, he was brought back to the exact place where it had all happened. The gallows were constructed at Auschwitz I, positioned deliberately near the crematorium, close to the very villa where he had once lived comfortably with his wife and children, just meters from where hundreds of thousands of people had been murdered under his command. On April 16, 1947, he was led outside. There were no crowds cheering, no dramatic final speech recorded for history, just a quiet, procedural execution carried out by Polish authorities in the same location where he had once presided over unimaginable suffering. Rudolf Host was hanged. It became the final execution ever carried out at Auschwitz. After years of industrialized murder, after a system built specifically to kill as many people as efficiently as possible, the last person to die there was the man who had designed that very system. For nearly 5 years, Auschwitz existed to take innocent lives. Its final execution was the only one ever carried out there in the name of justice. That doesn't erase what happened. Nothing ever could. The math of it never balances. One death against over 1 million never will. But history has a strange way of closing its darkest chapters. The man who built a machine to end over 1 million lives ended his own in the same place, standing in the shadow of what he had made. Today, Auschwitz remains one of the darkest and most solemn places in human history. Millions of people visit each year, walking the same paths, standing near the same buildings, not to mark a victory, but to remember, to understand how ordinary men, in the right system, became capable of the unimaginable, and to make sure none of it is ever repeated. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep dives into the darkest chapters of history, subscribe to Dead Empires.